The autumn rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office, each droplet racing down the glass like tears Benjamin Cross refused to shed. He sat motionless in his custom titanium wheelchair, staring out at the Seattle skyline where his empire of technology companies stretched across the city like digital veins. At 32, Benjamin had built CrossTech Industries from a college dorm room idea into a multi-billion-dollar corporation that revolutionized cloud computing. Yet now, 18 months after the accident, that changed everything. He felt smaller than he ever had as a struggling student. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Cross, the quarterly board meeting is in an hour. Should I prepare the conference room?" Benjamin's jaw tightened. "Cancel it. Send them the reports electronically. Sir, this is the third meeting you've postponed this month. The board members are concerned about your absence from public appearances. Let them be concerned." Benjamin replied, his voice cold as winter steel. "I built this company. I can run it from anywhere." The assistant hesitated at the door. "There's also the invitation to the Children's Hospital Charity Gala next week. It's the annual fundraiser you've supported for 5 years. Benjamin spun his wheelchair around, his dark eyes flashing with anger. No more galas. No more public events. Just business. Nothing else. After the assistant left, Benjamin returned to his window vigil. The man who once commanded boardrooms and graced magazine covers now lived like a ghost in his own life. The accident had stolen more than his ability to walk. It had taken his confidence, his social circle, and his faith in the future. His fiancée had left 3 months after the crash. Unable to handle what she called the new reality, friends had gradually stopped calling, their discomfort with his condition creating an invisible barrier that grew. Wider each day, the penthouse felt more like a prison than a home. Despite its luxury, the marble floors, imported artwork, and smart home technology that responded to his voice commands, Benjamin felt trapped by his own success. He had everything money could buy, but nothing his heart truly needed. Meanwhile, across the city, in a modest neighborhood, Grace Mitchell was having a very different kind of difficult day. She stood behind the counter of Chapter and Verse, the independent bookstore where she worked as manager, trying to balance the register while keeping one eye on her 7-year-old son Tommy, who was supposed to be doing homework in the back corner. "Mom, this math is impossible," Tommy announced, his pencil abandoned on the table. "Why do I need to know how many apples Sarah has if she gives away half?" Grace smiled despite her exhaustion. "Because someday you might have apples to give away. You'll want to make sure you keep enough for yourself." Tommy considered this seriously. What if Sarah just wanted to make friends? Maybe she gave away her apples because she was lonely, the wisdom in her son's innocent. Observation hit Grace unexpectedly. At 28, she often felt like Sarah with the apples, giving pieces of herself to make connections while wondering if anyone would ever give something back to her. As a single mother working 2 jobs, Grace's days blurred together in a cycle of responsibilities that left little room for her own dreams. The bookstores. Bell chimed as Mrs. Patterson, one of their regular customers, entered with her walker. Grace immediately came around the counter to help, but Tommy beat her to it, carefully opening the door wider and offering his small arm for support. "What a gentleman you're raising," Mrs. Patterson said to Grace, patting Tommy's head. "This boy has a heart bigger than most adults I know." Grace felt a familiar swell of pride mixed with worry. Tommy's compassionate nature was beautiful, but she feared the world might not always appreciate his kindness. She had learned the hard way that good hearts sometimes got broken by people who didn't understand their value. The afternoon passed quietly until closing time. As Grace locked up the store, Tommy pressed his face against the window, watching the early evening crowd hurry past on the sidewalk. "Mom, why does that man in the big car look so sad?" Tommy asked, pointing to a black Mercedes that had stopped at the red light. Grace looked where he was pointing, but could only see tinted windows. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes people carry invisible sadness, like you do sometimes." The question caught Grace off guard. She knelt down to Tommy's level, brushing a strand of his brown hair from his forehead. "What makes you think I'm sad?" "You get that look when you think, I'm not watching." The same look Mrs. Patterson gets when she talks about her husband who died. Like you're missing something important. Grace's throat tightened with emotion. Tommy's perceptiveness never ceased to amaze her, even when it revealed truths she tried to hide. She was missing something important. She missed having a partner to share the daily joys and struggles of raising Tommy. She missed adult conversation that went beyond work schedules and grocery lists. Most of all, she missed feeling like a complete person rather than just someone's mother or employee. Everyone misses things sometimes, she said carefully. But that doesn't mean we can't be happy with what we have. I know, Tommy said, taking her hand as they walked to their old Honda Civic. But maybe someday we'll find what we're missing. Like in the fairy tales you read to me that evening, in their small apartment above the Thai restaurant. Grace tucked Tommy into bed and read him a chapter from his favorite book about a knight who saved a kingdom not through fighting, but through kindness. As Tommy drifted off to sleep, Grace found herself wondering if real life ever worked like fairy tales. Did broken people really find each other and heal together? Or was that just wishful thinking designed to sell books and movie tickets? Across town, Benjamin lay awake in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed below. His physical therapist had been pleased with his progress that day, noting improvements in his upper body strength and coordination. But physical healing felt meaningless when his spirit remained shattered. He thought about the charity gala invitation sitting on his desk. It's the same event where he had met his ex-fiancée 3 years ago. She had been impressed by his philanthropic speeches and the way other wealthy donors sought his opinion. Now the thought of facing those same people, seeing their mixture of pity and discomfort, made his stomach clench with dread. Sleep finally came, but it brought dreams of the accident. The screech of brakes, the moment of weightlessness before impact, and then the long darkness that had swallowed 2 years of his life. He woke with a start, his heart pounding and sheets soaked with sweat. These nightmares visited him regularly, reminders that some things could never be undone. The next morning brought the first clear sky Seattle had seen in weeks. Benjamin decided to venture out to his favorite coffee shop, a small place tucked between a vintage clothing store and a used bookshop. He had discovered it during his recovery. When leaving the house had been a monumental effort that required careful planning and considerable courage. The cafe's accessibility features and the staff's natural, unforced kindness had made it a sanctuary where he could almost forget about being different. Almost as he wheeled through the door, Benjamin noticed a woman and young boy at a corner table. The woman was reading while the boy worked on what appeared to be a school project, occasionally asking questions that made her smile. There was something peaceful about their dynamic, a natural ease that Benjamin envied. They looked like they belonged together, complete in their small circle of two. He ordered his usual black coffee and found a table near the window, where he could watch the morning foot traffic without feeling too exposed. The boy at the nearby table kept glancing his way with the curious but unafraid gaze that only children possessed. When their eyes met, the boy smiled and waved. Benjamin found himself waving back, surprising himself with the automatic response. It had been months since anyone had acknowledged him with such simple, uncomplicated friendliness. The woman looked up from her book, following her son's gaze to Benjamin. For a moment, their eyes met across the small space, and Benjamin saw something unexpected. Not pity, not discomfort, but a kind of recognition. As if she understood what it meant to carry invisible weight. She smiled softly and returned to her reading. But something in that brief exchange had shifted in the air between them. Benjamin found himself lingering over his coffee longer than usual, stealing glances at the mother and son who seemed to inhabit their own peaceful world. When they finally gathered their things to leave, the boy stopped by Benjamin's table. "I like your chair," Tommy said with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children could manage. "It looks like it could go really fast." "Tommy?" Grace said gently, moving to collect her son, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "It's okay," Benjamin said, finding his voice. "He's right. It can go pretty fast when I need it to. Like a superhero vehicle." Tommy asked, his eyes lighting up with excitement. Benjamin felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The first genuine one he had experienced in months. Something like that. Grace met Benjamin's eyes again, and this time her smile held a note of gratitude for his kindness to her son. "Come on, superhero expert. We need to get you to school." As they left, Benjamin found himself thinking about the brief encounter for the rest of the morning. There had been something different about the woman's presence. Something that made him feel less like a broken thing and more like a person who happened to use a wheelchair for the first time in 18 months. Benjamin Cross wondered if there might be more to life than the walls he had built around himself. 3 weeks passed before Benjamin saw Grace and Tommy again at the coffee shop. This time he arrived to find them already settled at their usual corner table, but something was different. Grace looked tired, more worn down than before, and Tommy sat quietly coloring instead of his usual animated chatter about school projects. Benjamin ordered his coffee and hesitated before approaching their table. Social interactions had become foreign territory for him, each conversation feeling like navigating a minefield of potential awkwardness. But something about their subdued energy drew him forward. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from them. Grace looked up. Benjamin caught a glimpse of stress lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Of course," she said, managing a smile. "Tommy was just asking about you yesterday, weren't you?" Tommy nodded solemnly. His crayon paused mid-stroke on his coloring book. "I told my teacher about the superhero chair. She didn't believe me." "Teachers can be skeptical," Benjamin said, settling his wheelchair beside the table. "What are you working on there?" "It's supposed to be my family," Tommy explained, showing Benjamin a drawing of 2 stick figures standing in front of a small house. "But I ran out of people." The innocent statement hung in the air, and Benjamin saw Grace's jaw tighten slightly. He recognized the look of someone trying to hold everything together while the world seemed determined to remind them of what they lacked. "Sometimes families come in different sizes," Benjamin said carefully. "What matters is that the people in your family care about each other. Do you have a family?" Tommy asked with the directness that made adults uncomfortable, but that Benjamin was beginning to appreciate. "Not the traditional kind," Benjamin admitted. "But I'm learning that family can mean different things to different people." Grace studied Benjamin's face as he spoke to her son, noting the patience in his voice and the way he took Tommy's questions seriously, without talking down to him. Most adults either ignored Tommy completely or spoke to him like he was much younger than his 7 years. "Tommy, why don't you get us some napkins from the counter?" Grace suggested, recognizing her son's restless energy. As Tommy bounded away, Grace turned to Benjamin with a more serious expression. "I hope he's not bothering you with all his questions. He's going through a phase where he wants to understand everything about everyone." "He's not bothering me at all," Benjamin said honestly. "When did you stop bringing him here regularly?" "I noticed you've been absent." Grace's fingers wrapped around her coffee cup like it was an anchor. "Work has been complicated lately. The bookstore is struggling, and I picked up extra shifts at a restaurant to make ends meet. Tommy's been spending more time with my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, but she can't always watch him." Benjamin heard the exhaustion in her voice, the weight of carrying too much responsibility alone. He understood that burden, though his came from wealth rather than the lack of it. Both kinds of isolation could be equally crushing. "What kind of restaurant work?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than making polite conversation. "Waitressing at Romano's downtown. It's good money, especially with tips, but the hours are unpredictable. Sometimes I don't get home until after midnight, and then I have to be at the bookstore by 9 the next morning." Benjamin did quick mental math and realized Grace was probably working close to 70 hours a week between her 2 jobs. The dedication was admirable, but he could see it was taking a toll on both her and Tommy. Tommy returned with a handful of napkins, clearly having taken his mission seriously. "Mom, can we tell Benjamin about the problem with our car?" "Tommy, that's not something we need to burden other people with," Grace said quickly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "What's wrong with your car?" Benjamin asked, ignoring Grace's obvious discomfort. Tommy looked between his mother and Benjamin before deciding to forge ahead. "It makes a really scary noise when Mom starts it, and yesterday's smoke came out of the front. Mom says we might have to take the bus for a while." Grace closed her eyes briefly. and Benjamin could see her calculating expenses in her head, weighing the cost of car repairs against other necessities. He had forgotten what it felt like to worry about money, to have to choose between fixing a car and paying rent. "Have you had it looked at by a mechanic?" Benjamin asked. "The estimate was $1,200, Grace said quietly. "Right now, that might as well be $12,000. Benjamin sat back in his wheelchair, processing this information. $1,200 was less than he spent on coffee in a month, but for Grace, it represented an insurmountable obstacle that could affect every aspect of her and Tommy's life. "I might know someone who could help," Benjamin said carefully. "A friend who owns a garage downtown. He's honest and fair with his pricing." Grace shook her head immediately. "That's very kind, but we'll figure something out. We always do." Benjamin recognized the pride in her refusal, same fierce independence that had helped him build his company. But he also saw the fear underneath. The knowledge that sometimes determination wasn't enough to solve practical problems. Over the next hour, their conversation drifted to lighter topics. Benjamin found himself talking about his early days in tech, the excitement of building something from nothing, while Grace shared stories about the bookstore's quirky customers and Tommy's latest school adventures. What surprised Benjamin most was how natural the conversation felt. Grace didn't ask about his accident or treat him like a tragedy to be pitied. She spoke to him like a person, responding to his humor and challenging his opinions about books and current events. It had been so long since someone had engaged with his mind rather than focusing on his disability. When Tommy announced he was hungry, Grace began gathering their things to leave. "We should probably head home for lunch," she said. "Actually," Benjamin said, the words coming out before he could second-guess himself, "there's a great sandwich place next door. My treat, if you're interested." Grace hesitated. Benjamin could see her internal struggle between pride and practicality. Tommy, however, had no such reservations. "Can we, Mom, please? I promise I'll eat all my vegetables at dinner." "You should eat your vegetables anyway," Grace said. But her resistance was weakening. "Consider it payment for the entertainment," Benjamin said with a smile. "Tommy's been the best company I've had in months," something in Benjamin's tone convinced Grace that his offer came from genuine enjoyment of their company rather than pity. She nodded slowly. "Okay, but just this once." The sandwich shop next door was small and crowded, but the owner quickly rearranged tables to accommodate Benjamin's wheelchair. As they waited for their food, Tommy peppered Benjamin with questions about technology and business, displaying a curiosity that impressed both adults. "Do you think computers will ever be smarter than people?" Tommy asked, biting into his grilled cheese sandwich. "In some ways they already are," Benjamin replied. "But computers can't do the most important things that people do." "Like what?" "Like care about each other. Like make art or music that moves people's hearts. Like have conversations over lunch that make you forget about your problems for a while." Grace met Benjamin's eyes across the table, understanding that his last comment was directed at her. For the first time in weeks, she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The constant worry about money and Tommy's future was still there, but it felt manageable when shared, even temporarily, with someone who seemed to genuinely understand. After lunch, as they prepared to part ways, Benjamin made a decision that surprised him with its boldness. "Grace, I have a proposition for you," he said. "My home office has been feeling pretty isolated lately, and I've been thinking about working somewhere with more life around it. Would you mind if I became a regular at the bookstore? I could set up in a corner somewhere and work on my laptop. I promise not to scare away customers." Grace looked puzzled. "You want to work at Chapter and Verse? But you must have a beautiful office at your company." "I do," Benjamin admitted. "But beautiful doesn't always mean comfortable. Your bookstore has something my office doesn't." "What's that?" "Soul," Benjamin said simply. "And if I'm going to be there regularly, maybe I could help with some of the heavy lifting or reach high shelves. Consider it a trade for the workspace." Grace studied his face, trying to understand his motivation. She saw loneliness there, carefully hidden, but unmistakable once he knew how to look for it. It was the same loneliness she carried, the exhaustion of facing every challenge alone. "The bookstore doesn't exactly have wheelchair accessibility," she warned. Then maybe it's time it did, Benjamin said. I know some contractors who specialize in that kind of work. And before you say anything about charity, consider it an investment. Accessible businesses serve more customers. Tommy tugged on his mother's sleeve. Say yes. Mom, then we can see Benjamin every day. Grace looked between her son's hopeful face and Benjamin's patient expression. Something inside her recognized that this moment was important, that saying yes might change more than just her daily routine. Okay, she said finally. But you're paying for your own coffee? Benjamin laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuine joy. Deal. As they walked back to the parking garage where Benjamin's modified Mercedes waited, Grace found herself wondering what she had just agreed to. Letting Benjamin into their small world felt risky, like opening a door she had kept carefully locked since Tommy's father had walked away. But watching Tommy chatter excitedly about showing Benjamin his favorite books, Grace realized that some risks might be worth taking. Her son deserved to have positive male influences in his life, and if she was honest with herself, she deserved to have adult friendship and support. Benjamin sat in his car after Grace and Tommy had driven away in their aging
Honda.
Listening to the concerning noise from their engine, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Jake Martinez, who owned the most reliable auto repair shop in the city. Jake, it's Benjamin Cross. I need a favor. 30 minutes later, he had arranged for Jake to randomly encounter Grace's car in the bookstore's parking lot and offer a deeply discounted repair service. It wasn't charity if she never knew he was involved. That evening, Benjamin found himself looking forward to tomorrow in a way he hadn't experienced since before the accident. For the first time in 18 months, he had something to anticipate beyond physical therapy appointments and board meetings. Grace. Meanwhile, tucked Tommy into bed and listened to his excited recap of their day with Benjamin. As her son drifted off to sleep, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have a partner in the daily adventure of raising a child. Someone who could share both the burdens and the joys. The thought scared her, but it also filled her with a hope she had almost forgotten how to feel. 6 months had transformed the small bookstore into something magical. Benjamin had quietly funded the accessibility renovations, including a wheelchair ramp, wider aisles, and an adjustable height service counter. What had started as a simple arrangement for him to work in the corner had evolved into something much deeper. Grace had promoted him to an official business consultant, while he had discovered a passion for recommending books to customers who seemed surprised that the man in the wheelchair possessed such extensive knowledge about literature. The morning, autumn light streamed through the newly installed skylights as Grace arranged a display of seasonal poetry books. Benjamin worked at his laptop nearby, occasionally glancing up to watch her graceful movements as she transformed the ordinary into something beautiful. Over the months, he had fallen in love not just with Grace's kindness, but with her intelligence, her fierce protectiveness of Tommy, and the way she could find wonder in the smallest moments. Tommy burst through the front door after school, his backpack sliding off one shoulder as he rushed to Benjamin's table. Benjamin, guess what happened today? Let me think, Benjamin said, closing his laptop and giving Tommy his full attention. You discovered a new planet, taught your teacher advanced mathematics, or rescued a cat from a tree? Better, Tommy announced, climbing into the chair across from Benjamin. Mrs. Henderson said, I can bring a special guest to Career Day next week, and I want to bring you. Grace looked up from her book display, catching the surprise and pleasure that flickered across Benjamin's face. Over the months, she had watched him transform from a guarded, isolated man into someone who genuinely enjoyed human connection. Tommy had been the catalyst, but she liked to think she had played a part in his healing too. What would I talk about? Benjamin asked, though Grace could see he was already considering the possibility. Everything, Tommy said with 7-year-old enthusiasm. About building companies and being smart and how you help people, even though you use a wheelchair. Jimmy Peterson's dad is just an accountant, but you're like a real-life Tony Stark. Benjamin laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. I think you might be overselling me, buddy. But if your mom thinks it's okay, I'd be honored to come to your career day. Grace felt her heart skip as she watched the two most important people in her life plan. Somewhere along the way, without either of them quite acknowledging it, Benjamin had become part of their family. He picked Tommy up from school when Grace was running late, helped with homework that required patience she sometimes lacked after long days, and had even learned to make Tommy's favorite grilled cheese sandwiches for their weekend lunch dates. The bell above the door chimed, and Grace looked up to see a woman in an expensive suit scanning the store with obvious distaste. She was beautiful in the way that required significant financial investment, with perfectly styled blonde hair and jewelry that probably cost more than Grace made in a year. "Benjamin." The woman called out, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "What are you doing in this place?" Benjamin's entire body went rigid. Grace watched the warmth drain from his face, placed by the same guarded expression he had worn when she first met him 6 months ago. "Victoria," he said carefully, "this is unexpected. Victoria Cross, Benjamin's ex-fiancée." Moved through the bookstore like she was navigating a minefield, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. Her eyes swept over the cozy reading nooks, the handwritten staff recommendations, and the children's section where Tommy had built a fort out of oversized pillows. "I heard rumors that you were spending time in some little bookshop, but I didn't believe them," Victoria said, her gaze landing on Grace with obvious assessment. "This is so unlike you." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly conscious of her simple clothes and the ink stains on her fingers from changing the store's promotional displays. She had never felt more aware of the difference between her world and Benjamin's. "Actually, this is exactly like me," Benjamin said quietly. "You just never bothered to notice." Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Benjamin, darling, I know you've been going through a difficult adjustment period. This is taking things a bit far, don't you think? Playing house with ... She gestured vaguely toward Grace, leaving the sentence deliberately unfinished. Tommy, who had been coloring quietly at Benjamin's table, looked up with the direct stare that made adults uncomfortable. "Are you being mean to my mom and Benjamin?" Victoria blinked, apparently surprised to discover a child in the conversation. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "This is Tommy," Benjamin said, his voice carrying a warning edge that Grace had never heard before. "And you're right to apologize, because yes, you are being mean." The tension in the bookstore was thick enough to cut. Grace wished she could disappear into the stacks, but Tommy was watching the interaction with the intense curiosity that meant he would have questions later. Questions she wasn't sure she could answer. "Benjamin, could I speak with you privately?" Victoria asked, her tone suggesting it wasn't really a request. Benjamin looked at Grace, who nodded reluctantly. She understood that some conversations from the past needed to happen. Even when they threatened to complicate the present, they moved to a quiet corner near the poetry section. But the bookstore was small enough that Grace couldn't help overhearing fragments of their conversation. "This isn't you," Victoria was saying. "The Benjamin I knew had ambition, drive. He didn't hide away in little shops playing mentor to other people's children. The Benjamin you knew was a workaholic who measured his worth by his bank account," Benjamin replied. "Maybe this version is an improvement. Don't be ridiculous. You built an empire. You have responsibilities, shareholders, a reputation to maintain. What will people think when they see you here with her?" Grace felt each word like a physical blow. She had always known that she and Benjamin came from different worlds. Victoria's presence made those differences feel insurmountable. What was she thinking, allowing herself to care for a man whose ex-fiancé wore shoes that cost more than Grace's monthly rent? "What I think," Benjamin said, his voice growing stronger, "is that for the first time in my adult life, I'm happy. Genuinely, completely happy. And if you can't understand that, then I'm grateful you walked away when you did." Victoria's voice rose slightly. "Happy? Benjamin, you're in a wheelchair. Your life is never going to be what it was. At least with me, you could maintain some dignity, some status. This woman, she's clearly taking advantage of your vulnerability." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Grace felt her chest tighten with a mixture of hurt and anger. She had never asked Benjamin for anything, had insisted on paying her own way whenever possible, and had fallen in love with him despite his wealth. Not because of it. Benjamin's response was quiet but forceful enough to carry across the store. Grace has given me more in 6 months than you gave me in 3 years. She sees me as a person, not as a bank account or a status symbol. And if you ever suggest again that she's using me, this conversation will be over permanently. Tommy looked up from his coloring book, his young face creased with concern. Mom, why does that lady sound angry? Grace knelt beside her son, trying to keep her voice steady. Sometimes adults have difficult conversations about the past, sweetheart. It doesn't mean anything bad is going to happen. But even as she said the words, Grace wondered if they were true. Victoria's arrival had shattered the peaceful bubble she and Benjamin had created together. All the doubts she had carefully suppressed came rushing back. What future could they really have together? How long before Benjamin grew tired of her simple life and returned to his world of board meetings and charity galas? The conversation in the corner was winding down. Victoria gathered her purse and walked toward the door, but she paused beside Grace on her way out. He'll get bored, she said quietly, just loud enough for Grace to hear. Men like Benjamin always do. And when he does, you'll be left explaining to your son why another father figure has disappeared from his life. The words hit Grace like a physical blow, striking at her deepest fear. She had sworn to protect Tommy from the kind of heartbreak she had experienced, yet here she was, allowing both of them to become attached to someone who might not stay. Victoria left without another word, but her presence lingered like smoke in the air. Benjamin returned to his table, but the easy companionship of the morning had been replaced by an uncomfortable tension. I'm sorry about that, Benjamin said quietly. Victoria has a talent for making everything more complicated than it needs to be. Grace nodded, but she couldn't meet his eyes. Victoria's words echoed in her mind, feeding doubts that had been growing stronger each day. What was she doing, falling in love with a billionaire? People like Benjamin didn't end up with people like her, not in real life. The rest of the afternoon passed in strained politeness. Tommy seemed to sense the change in atmosphere and stayed unusually quiet, dividing his attention between his homework and worried glances at the adults. When closing time came, Grace was grateful for the excuse to end the awkward day. Grace, Benjamin said, as she locked the front door, can we talk? She turned to face him, and the concern in his dark eyes nearly broke her resolve. Benjamin, maybe Victoria was right about some things, such as... Grace took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would hurt them both. We're from different worlds. You have responsibilities, expectations. I'm just a single mother who manages a bookstore. Maybe we've been kidding ourselves that this could work. Benjamin's face went pale. Is that really what you think? Or is that what Victoria convinced you to think? Does it matter? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The result is the same. Tommy appeared at her side, having finished packing his backpack. He looked between his mother and Benjamin with the intuitive understanding that children possess about adult emotions. Are you fighting? He asked quietly. No, sweetheart, Grace said, though her voice cracked slightly. Benjamin and I are just talking about some grown-up things. Benjamin reached out and took Tommy's hand. Hey, buddy. Remember how I told you that sometimes adults need to have difficult conversations? This is one of those times. But it doesn't change how much I care about you and your mom. Tommy nodded solemnly, but Grace could see the worry in his young eyes. She had done exactly what she had sworn not to do. She had let someone into their lives who might leave. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed, Grace sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at her phone. Benjamin had texted twice, asking if they could talk, but she hadn't responded. How could she explain that her silence wasn't about anger, but about fear? Fear that Victoria was right, that she was setting herself and Tommy up for heartbreak. Meanwhile, Benjamin sat in his penthouse apartment, staring out at the city lights and realizing how empty his luxury felt without Grace and Tommy to share it with. He had fought so hard to build this empire, but what was the point of having everything if you had no one who truly mattered to share it with? He picked up his phone and dialed Grace's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Her recorded voice, warm and familiar, nearly brought tears to his eyes. Grace, it's me. I know today was difficult. And I know Victoria stirred up doubts that were probably already there. But I need you to know something. You and Tommy aren't a convenience or a phase for me. You're my heart. You're the reason I wake up excited about the day instead of dreading it. I love you, Grace. I love Tommy, and I don't care what anyone else thinks about that. Please don't let Victoria's bitterness poison what we've built together. He ended the call and sat back in his wheelchair, feeling more helpless than he had since the early days after his accident. For the first time in his life, all his wealth and influence meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was beyond his power to control. 3 days passed without contact between them. Benjamin continued to work at the bookstore, but the atmosphere was strained and formal. Grace was polite but distant, and Tommy seemed confused by the sudden change in dynamics. The boy kept asking when Benjamin would come to career day, but Grace deflected his questions with vague promises to discuss it later. On Thursday evening, as Grace was closing the store alone, she found an envelope that had been slipped under the door. Inside was a letter in Benjamin's careful handwriting, along with a check that made her gasp. Grace, the letter began. I've been thinking about what Victoria said, and I realized she was right about one thing. You deserve better than a man who hides away from the world. You deserve someone who stands up for what he believes in, who fights for the people he loves. The check is payment for 6 months of the happiest, most fulfilling work I've ever done. You've given me purpose, beyond profit margins and board meetings. You've shown me what it means to be part of a real family. I'm not asking you to forgive my cowardice, or to pretend that our different backgrounds don't matter. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that love can bridge any gap, if we're brave enough to let it. Tomorrow's Tommy's career day. I'll be there whether you want me to be or not, because I made a promise to him. But more than that, I'll be there because I want to tell a room full of children that the most important career anyone can have is loving the people who matter most. I love you, Grace. I love Tommy. And I'm tired of being afraid of what other people think about that, your devoted friend, and hopefully more. Benjamin. Grace read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She looked at the check, which was enough to pay off her student loans, fix her car, and put money away for Tommy's college fund. But more than the financial gesture, she was moved by the words, by the man who had found the courage to fight for what mattered most to him. The next morning, Grace dressed carefully in her best outfit and arrived at Tommy's school with nervous energy buzzing through her system. She found Benjamin in the hallway outside Tommy's classroom, adjusting his tie with hands that trembled slightly. You came, he said when he saw her, relief evident in his voice. I had to, Grace replied. Someone I care about very much is giving a very important presentation today. Benjamin's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. Grace, about what I said in the letter, ... later, she said softly. Right now, Tommy needs both of us. They entered the classroom together, and Tommy's face broke into a huge grin when he saw them. You both came, he announced to the class. This is Benjamin, and he's the smartest person I know. Benjamin moved his wheelchair to the front of the classroom, and Grace took a seat in the back, watching as the man she loved prepared to share his story with 20 curious 7-year-olds. Double quotes. Hi, everyone, Benjamin began, his voice warm and confident. My name is Benjamin Cross. I want to tell you about the most important thing I've learned in my career. For the next 30 minutes, Benjamin talked about building his company, about the importance of education and hard work, but mostly about how true success was measured by the relationships you build and the people you help along the way. He talked about how his wheelchair had taught him that being different wasn't something to be ashamed of, but something that could give you a unique perspective on the world. When he finished, hands shot up around the room with questions that ranged from technical inquiries about computer programming to personal questions about his disability. Benjamin answered each one with patience and honesty, treating every child's curiosity with respect. Mr. Benjamin, a little girl named Ashley asked, "Are you going to marry Tommy's mom?" The classroom erupted in giggles, and Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But Benjamin's response was serious and thoughtful. "That's up to Tommy's mom," he said, his eyes finding Grace in the back of the room. "But I hope so, because they've both taught me that the best things in life are worth waiting for and fighting for." After the presentation, as children clustered around Benjamin asking to see how his wheelchair worked, Grace approached the front of the classroom. Tommy was beaming with pride, showing off his special guest to anyone who would listen. "That was beautiful," Grace said quietly. "I meant every word," Benjamin replied. His eyes locked on hers. Grace took a deep breath. Knowing that this moment would determine the course of their future, "Benjamin, I've been scared. Scared of getting hurt, scared of Tommy getting hurt, scared that we're too different to make this work. And now?" he asked. "Now, I think maybe being scared isn't a good enough reason to give up on something wonderful," she said. "Victoria was wrong about one thing. You haven't changed since the accident. You've just become more yourself. And the person you really are is someone worth taking a risk for." Benjamin reached for her hand, and when she took it, he felt complete in a way that had nothing to do with his physical limitations and everything to do with the love that filled his heart. "Does this mean yes?" Tommy asked, appearing at their side with the radar that children have for important adult conversations. "Yes to what?" Grace asked, though she suspected she knew what her son was asking. "Yes to Benjamin being part of our family for real," Tommy said with the matter-of-fact tone that had become familiar to both adults. Grace looked at Benjamin, seeing in his eyes the same hope and love that filled her own heart. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." 6 months later, Chapter and Verse hosted its first wedding reception. The bookstore had been transformed with white lights and flowers, creating an intimate space filled with the people who mattered most to Grace and Benjamin. Tommy, resplendent in his role as ring-bearer, had insisted on wearing a cape under his formal suit, declaring that all the best weddings needed at least one superhero, as they swayed together on the small dance floor. That had been cleared between the poetry and romance sections. Benjamin marveled at how perfectly Grace fit in his arms. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, chosen more for comfort than fashion. And she had never looked more beautiful to him. "Any regrets?" he asked, spinning her gently. "Only that it took us so long to get here," Grace replied, her eyes shining with happiness. Tommy danced nearby with Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who had become like a grandmother to him. The boy caught Benjamin's eye and gave him a thumbs up, his approval complete and unconditional. Benjamin had learned to stand with the help of braces and crutches for special occasions. But tonight, he remained in his wheelchair, content to dance with Grace in their own unique way. He had discovered that love wasn't about conforming to other people's expectations, but about finding someone who accepted you exactly as you were while inspiring you to become the best version of yourself. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Grace and Benjamin sat together in the quiet bookstore, surrounded by the books that had brought them together and the love that would carry them forward. "So what happens next?" Grace asked, her head resting on Benjamin's shoulder. "Next, we live happily ever after," Benjamin said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "One day, one book, one small miracle at a time." Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, but inside the little bookstore, 3 hearts that had found each other against all odds settled into the comfortable rhythm of a family that had chosen love over fear, hope over doubt, and each other over everything else the world had to offer. Tommy, who had fallen asleep in the children's section surrounded by his favorite books, smiled in his dreams knowing that he finally had the family he had always wished for, complete with a superhero dad who had taught him that the greatest strength came not from what your body could do, but from how big you allowed your heart to become.